When winter fell over Ironwood Harbor, it carried more than snow. It carried secrets. On that frozen night, a Coast Guard officer found a young bride collapsed in the snow beside an overturned wheelchair, and his loyal German shepherd sensed a danger far deeper than the storm itself. This was not a story of a woman who needed saving, but of a woman who would discover her own strength, and a man and dog who stood beside her when darkness came searching. If you are watching this from anywhere in the world, comment below and tell me where you are watching from. And please remember to subscribe to the channel to support us so we can continue bringing you these stories. Winter clung to Ironwood Harbor like a promise that had gone on too long. The storm that had hammered the small coastal town through the night had finally moved off into the Atlantic, leaving behind a world pressed flat and silent under a heavy quilt of snow. The sea, usually loud and quarrelsome even on good days, had dropped to a low, exhausted murmur, waves rolling in, slow and dark against hulls rimmed with ice. Fishing boats slept in their berths, their ropes stiff as old bones, while the harbor lights flickered weakly through curtains of fine, drifting snow. Ironwood Harbor was the kind of place people found when they were tired of being seen too clearly. Retired fishermen with bad knees, widows who still set 2 plates at dinner, men and women who carried stories they had no desire to explain. The town clung to a narrow strip of coast somewhere along the northern edge of America, where winter seemed to have a personal grudge, and the wind always smelled faintly of salt and pine. It was not a place of grand arrivals, it was a place of quiet exiles. Ethan Cole fit the town the way a weathered plank fit into an old pier, worn, useful, and not quite in the place he was meant to be, but holding anyway. He was 36, broad-shouldered but lean from years of work that couldn't be skipped just because the weather was bad. His height made him stand out in a crowd, but there were no crowds here, only the occasional fishermen and the gulls who considered themselves permanent residents. His dark hair was clipped short out of habit, a military cut he'd never really grown out of, and the beginnings of lines had formed around his gray-blue eyes. The kind of eyes that had watched too many seas and too many storms, and had learned to expect the worst, even while hoping for the best. Ethan's calm had been forged, not gifted. Years earlier, on a different coastline, he had lost a crewmate in a storm that refused to be reasoned with. A helicopter, a rescue cable, waves too tall, a decision that came a heartbeat late. Those pieces lived inside him, like broken glass that had settled but never fully dissolved. It made him methodical, measured, almost obsessively careful. He followed regulations not because he loved rules, but because he understood what it cost when people ignored them. For the last few years, he had been assigned to the small Coast Guard outpost at Ironwood Harbor, a squat building jutting out into the icy air on a concrete pier. When the storm took down the main power lines and ice chewed through the radio antenna, the outpost became a stranded island of metal and frost. The satellite link was gone, the landlines dead, the harbor road buried under drifts higher than a pickup. The station's emergency generator chugged on like an old smoker, powering only what was necessary. Minimal lights, a small heater, and a few instruments that still pretended to talk to the outside world. Somewhere in that half-frozen quiet moved Ridge. Ridge. It was a German shepherd, 4 years old, his body all angles of muscle and steady purpose beneath a thick sable and black coat. He had the classic shepherd lines. A noble head, dark, intelligent eyes, ears that stood tall and alert like listening towers. A faint scar ran along his right flank, hidden under his fur, except when he turned just so in the light. A reminder of a shard of metal from a collapsed roof during a search and rescue operation in the mountains 2 winters earlier. He had been bred for work, trained for focus, and tempered by more emergencies than most people saw in a lifetime. Where Ethan's caution came from guilt, Ridge's came from instinct and training, sharpened by repetition. The dog's loyalty was simple and absolute. Ethan was his handler, his partner, his human. Ridge scanned the world for danger the way other dogs sniffed for food. He knew the sounds of a harbor at rest, the creak of ropes, the clunk of loose fenders, the distant beat of waves against rocks. Anything that didn't fit was cataloged, weighed, and, if necessary, barked at with serious concern. Inside the outpost, the morning had sharpened into a pale, iron-gray day. Ice feathered across the windows, turning the outside world into a blurred watercolor of white and shadow. Ethan stood on a metal stool beneath a leaking strip of ceiling, tightening a bracket on a sheet of corrugated tin he'd hastily nailed up to keep wind-driven snow from sneaking in. The last gust had rattled the roof hard enough to wake every memory he had of roofs failing and ceilings collapsing. He told himself he was just being thorough. Ridge, sprawled near the door like a lion at the entrance of a temple, watched him with half-lidded eyes that gave the illusion of sleep. In truth, the dog never fully turned off. Every squeak in the structure, every whine of the wind, every distant crack of settling ice landed somewhere in his awareness. Ethan finished with the bracket, his breath forming soft clouds in the chilly interior, and climbed down carefully. His heavy winter parka, a faded navy blue with reflective strips across the chest and sleeves, added bulk to his frame. Snow dusted his shoulders whenever he stepped outside, making him look as if he carried a piece of the storm with him wherever he went. He rolled his shoulders, testing a knot of tension that never seemed to go away, then glanced toward the dead radio console by reflex. "Nothing new," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "No one in, no one out." The backup handheld radio lay on the counter, its plastic casing scuffed, its battery indicator hovering in the kind of range that made responsible people nervous. Ethan had already decided to keep it silent unless a life truly hung on its last thread. Calls to command could wait. Lives could not. Ridge's ears flicked. It was small, subtle, but Ethan had worked with him long enough to recognize the shift instantly, like a bell inside his own chest. The dog's head rose, eyes sharpening. He was no longer half resting. He was listening, not just to the building, but through it. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked quietly. Ridge didn't answer, obviously, but his body did. He stood, weight evenly balanced, nose lifting as he drew scent into his lungs. The world outside had the usual signatures: salt, oil, frozen rope, the faint ghost of fish that had once been bright and furious and were now someone's dinner. But underneath that, thin, fragile, nearly erased by cold, was something else. Human. Fear. Something wrong. Ridge let out a deep, low growl that didn't speak of anger so much as urgency. The kind of sound he made when a floor was about to give way, or a buried gas leak was close to ignition. His gaze snapped toward the door, tail stiff, muscles coiled. Ethan's pulse ticked up. He'd learned to trust that growl more than some men trusted radar. "Show me," he said. The words were simple, a cue they'd used on training fields and real disasters alike. Ridge lunged toward the door, then paused just long enough for Ethan to shrug into his gloves and pull up the hood of his parka. Cold knifed through the crack as he opened the door, a blast of air sharp with salt and snow, but there was something else riding on it now, a faint metallic scent, like hairpins and fear. The sky outside was a flat lid of silver, pressing down on the iron-gray water. Snow lay in deep drifts along the pier, sculpted by the wind into hills and valleys that turned familiar shapes into strange, softened mounds. Ice crusted the railings in thick white shells. Tire tracks from the night before had nearly vanished under fresh snow, ghost lines leading nowhere. Ridge bounded ahead, his paws punching neat holes into the untouched surface, sending up small puffs of powder that glittered briefly before settling again. He didn't slip. His body knew how to move on treacherous ground, adjusting without thought. Ethan followed, boots crunching, the cold biting through layers of wool and synthetic fabric. Each breath burned at the edges of his lungs. The station sat near the mouth of the harbor, with a long pier extending like a finger pointing toward the open ocean. On one side lay the town, tucked back against low hills where dark pines shouldered the weight of the snow. On the other side, the world dissolved into sea and sky, a vast, indifferent expanse. Ridge didn't head toward town. He veered down the slope toward the lower docks, where a narrow lane dropped to a service road that ran along the waterline. Ethan's mind ticked through possibilities with the same grim efficiency that sorted gear in a rescue locker. A fisherman who tried to check his boat in the storm, a tourist who had ignored warnings, a kid daring himself to go out into the blizzard and then discovering that winter didn't care about dares. But very few people came down to the harbor during a storm like the one that had just passed. Most of Ironwood Harbor knew better. Most. Ridge's growl tapered into a sharp, urgent bark as he crested a small snowbank and slid down the other side. Ethan's heart thudded once, hard. He pushed himself faster, grabbing the railing as he navigated the icy descent. The service road had become a white, uneven ribbon, with snowdrifts swallowing the edges. A few feet ahead, something broke the smoothness of the world, a dark, tilted shape half buried in snow near the edge of the pier. At first, in the harsh flat light, it looked like a crooked signpost or a piece of broken railing. Then the wind shifted, tugging at a flap of fabric, and the shape resolved into something horribly familiar. A wheelchair lay on its side in the snow, one wheel spinning slowly in the breeze, the other half buried. The metal frame was frosted with ice, its seat dusted in white. Next to it, a trail of disturbed snow led toward the edge of the pier and then curved back, like someone had slid, fallen, and then been dragged or had crawled, fighting gravity and cold. Ethan's world narrowed, training slid into place, not as a bolt of adrenaline, but as a calm, almost eerie clarity. He took in the scene in fragments, no fresh tire tracks nearby, indicating the chair hadn't rolled here from far away. The angle of the wheels suggesting a sudden tipping rather than a gentle descent. The way the snow was disturbed, not in careless arcs but in desperate clawing streaks. Ridge was already there, nose working rapidly, tail whipping once in a sharp, anxious line. Then Ethan saw her. The woman lay a few feet from the overturned chair, half covered in windblown snow. For a heartbeat, she could have been a discarded statue, some strange ceremonial figure abandoned in the wrong place. The dress she wore didn't belong to the harbor or the storm. It belonged to churches and summer gardens and rooms lit by chandeliers. White, now wet and heavy, its lace darkened with melted snow, the gown clung to her as if trying to pull her back into a world she clearly no longer wanted to be part of. She looked young, mid-20s perhaps, her body slender beneath the soaked layers of fabric. Dark hair spilled out from under a veil that had twisted off-center, strands frozen into delicate, brittle curls along her cheeks. Her skin, where it showed at her throat and hands, was too pale. Not the natural paleness of someone with fair coloring, but the washed-out, bluish hue of a body the cold had started to claim. Even in that stillness, traces of the person she was flickered through. The fine, strong lines of her jaw, hinting at stubbornness. The elegant fingers curled against the snow, suggesting someone who might have held pencils, brushes, or sheet music, more often than boat ropes or shopping bags. The life she'd been dressed for had not included ending up here. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, the shock of the cold seeping through his trousers as he brushed snow away from her face and shoulders. "Hey," he said, voice firm but gentle, the tone of someone calling a person back from the edge instead of pushing them. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her lashes fluttered weakly, dark against skin that looked too thin, too fragile. Her lips were slightly parted, breath shallow and rough. Not gone. Not yet. Ridge pressed in close, his warm breath ghosting over her cheek as he sniffed carefully, his body forming a solid, living barrier between her and the open drop to the water. He didn't bark now. He simply stood there, muscles taut, as if holding the world in place by sheer will. Ethan's gaze flicked once to the overturned chair. Wheelchair. Not a skid mark from a car or a motorcycle. This was how she had come here. Questions spiked through his mind like shards of ice. How had a bride in a wheelchair ended up alone at the frozen harbor during a storm? Who had brought her? Who had left her? But questions could wait. Hypothermia could not. He slipped a gloved hand under her neck, tilting her gently to open her airway, feeling for the pulse in her throat. It trembled under his fingers, thin but present, a fragile thread tying her to the world. "We've got you," he murmured, as much for Ridge as for her, as if the dog needed to hear that Ethan was all in. "You're not staying out here?" Her eyes opened a fraction, unfocused, pupils wide from cold and fear. For a brief second, they locked onto Ethan's face, as if trying to decide whether he was another threat or something else entirely. And in that brief second, something passed between them. Not recognition, not yet, but the raw, startled awareness of two lives colliding at exactly the point where one of them might have ended. A faint breath escaped her lips, more exhale than word, but it carried the faintest ghost of sound, as if she were trying to answer a question he had not yet asked. The wind pushed at Ethan's back as if impatient. Snow swirled around them in restless little eddies. Above, the sky watched, indifferent and vast. Ethan shifted his grip, sliding one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees, bracing himself to lift. Ridge took a step backward, making room, but never broke his watch at the water's edge, never stopped scanning the blank line of the harbor road for anything that might come out of the white. On a morning when Ironwood Harbor had meant to be nothing more than a place dozing under fresh snow, a forgotten outpost on a forgotten coast, a man, a dog, and a fallen bride found themselves bound together by a storm that had not quite finished deciding whom it would let go. And as Ethan gathered her into his arms, he had no way of knowing that this moment at the edge of the pier, the overturned wheelchair, the ruined wedding dress, the dog who refused to look away, was the quiet beginning of a battle that would stretch far beyond the reach of the tide and the snow. The harbor seemed to retreat behind them as Ethan carried the unconscious woman through the snow-choked lane, Ridge trotting close beside him like a silent guardian. The wind cut through layers of clothing and fabric alike, but Ethan held her firmly, bracing each step against drifts and slippery patches. By the time he reached the outpost door, his breathing had deepened, controlled but heavy. Ridge shook snow from his coat as Ethan kicked the door shut behind them. The small station interior felt almost warm in contrast to the outside. Only warmer, not warm, but it was enough. He lowered the woman gently onto a wool blanket laid by the small heater. The heat was minimal, but it was steady, the kind old buildings produced when working at half capacity. He peeled snow-soaked lace and silk away from her body with careful hands, not prying, but freeing, ensuring nothing frozen remained pressed against skin. Ridge sat nearby, eyes fixed on her, posture alert but not aggressive, as though he had assigned himself the role of watcher against unseen threats. Ethan found her pulse again, still there, stronger now. He reached for warm compress packs from an emergency crate, laying them along her arms and torso. Not too hot, he knew better than to shock a hypothermic body. He retrieved an insulated mug of warm water, not boiling, and waited for consciousness. Minutes passed like drawn-out hours. Then her fingers twitched, her breath hitched, her eyes fluttered open. They were hazel, warm, even when clouded by shock. And when they landed on Ethan's face, there was confusion first, then recognition of safety. She tried to speak, her lips trembled without sound. "Easy," Ethan murmured. "You're safe. You're inside." Her voice finally emerged, brittle at the edges. Where am I?" "Ironwood Harbor Coast Guard outpost. You were outside in the snow, unconscious. I found you at the pier." Her eyes widened, not at the rescue, but at the memory. As awareness returned, so did something else, fear. But she swallowed it. She blinked, once, twice, as if accounting for herself, then slowly pushed herself upward to sit. Ethan noticed her posture, cautious, refined, trained by a lifetime of maintaining dignity in front of others. The kind of composure not learned from books, learned from constantly being watched, evaluated, judged. He said, "I'm Ethan, and this is Ridge." The dog tilted his head, giving a soft huff through his nose that sounded oddly reassuring. She managed the faintest nod. Clara Benson." Now that she was awake, Ethan could see details more clearly. She was in her mid-20s, perhaps 24 or 25, tallish and slender beneath the blanket, with long dark hair that had begun thawing into damp curls. Her skin had almost returned to a natural tone, but her cheeks still held a pink flush of shock. Clara had the face of a person who had been raised with gentle expectations, music lessons, private schooling, quiet cultural refinement. But somewhere along the way, life had taken her through something harsher. Ethan saw it in the tension at her jaw, in the way her hands held each other too tightly. Ridge scooted closer, pressing his side lightly against Clara's knee. The dog's instincts were uncanny. He could detect deceit, agitation, and violence, and he sensed none of that in her, only truth and fear that came from the pursuit of something or someone. She caught her breath, looked down at herself, then at the blanket, realizing fully that she was no longer in the snow. "I'm sorry if this is," she began. "You have nothing to apologize for," Ethan interrupted gently. "You nearly froze to death." She let out a thin, unsteady laugh, a sound carrying exhaustion rather than humor. "I thought I was going to." Ethan waited. He did not ask questions yet. Years in service had taught him when silence opened doors better than interrogation. Clara wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her eyes drifted to the heater's glow, and then to the radio console behind Ethan. She asked, "Is there any communication with the mainland?" Ethan shook his head. "Not until the lines thaw and the antenna is replaced. Storm took everything down. We're isolated." Her lips parted, and in that instant, Ethan saw both relief and dread. Relief. No one could find her quickly. Dread. She was truly alone, without escape, if danger reached her. He sat opposite her on a crate, keeping a respectful distance. Ridge stayed between them like a quiet mediator. Clara's fingers tightened in the blanket. She breathed slowly, focusing, gathering strength. And then she spoke. "I wasn't supposed to be at the harbor. I wasn't supposed to be outside at all." Her voice quivered, not from cold now, but memory. "There was a wedding today. My wedding." Ethan's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. She swallowed. "I didn't fall from the pier. I didn't accidentally end up in the snow." Her gaze dropped to her hands, slender and elegant. The hands of someone who painted, wrote poetry, or played piano more often than manual labor. I ran from my own wedding ceremony." A pause. Ethan said nothing. Clara raised her eyes again and continued, voice steadier now that the truth was flowing. "Victor Hale, my fiancé, he isn't what people think he is. In public, he's polished, charming, gracious." Her expression tightened. "In private, he is controlling. He doesn't yell. He doesn't hit. He simply owns, or believes he does. The kind of man who gave orders as if granting mercy. The kind Ridge would instinctively distrust." Clara continued. "I had a bank account hidden. One my parents helped establish before they died. Money I could claim as my own. I withdrew almost all of it before the wedding and used it to leave. I arranged transportation to Ironwood Harbor. I thought the storm would give me time, shield me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But storms don't hide you forever. And men with money, they always find a way." Ethan absorbed this with the calm of a man accustomed to hearing confessions from strangers at their most vulnerable. His eyes didn't judge. They weighed, measured, and quietly accepted. Finally, he said, "You're safe here tonight. You need rest, food, warmth." She nodded, a small motion, grateful but also strained. Then her gaze fell to the wheelchair leaning beside the heater. And here was the crucial clarification, one that preserved her dignity. "My legs, they aren't paralyzed. I injured them leaving the venue. Someone tried to stop me. I fell, badly. The chair was temporary, a way to move when I couldn't walk long distances." Ethan's eyes flicked to Ridge, and Ridge, in response, relaxed. A lie would have made him stiffen, but her truth softened him. Clara noticed that, and reached out with tentative fingers to brush Ridge's neck. "He knew," she said softly, almost with wonder. "He knew I wasn't pretending." Ethan gave a faint smile. He's a good judge of character. She let out a slow breath, tension dissolving bit by bit. Outside the windows, the snow-laden world remained mute and remote, as though Ironwood Harbor existed somewhere between a prayer and a forgotten letter. The wind had eased, but the silence that followed was even deeper. They could have been the last 3 living beings in the world. Clara leaned back slightly, letting the heater's warmth soak into her bones. Her voice was steadier now. "I don't know what happens next, but for the first time in months, I feel like I'm not trapped anymore." And Ethan, who rarely allowed emotion to show through his stoic exterior, felt something shift beneath his ribs. Not attraction, not pity, but respect. He nodded once. "Then we start with survival, 1 hour at a time." Clara sank into the blanket and closed her eyes, trusting, finally, that she was no longer being tracked, ordered, or controlled. Ridge curled beside her, a sable-coated sentinel ready to stay awake the entire night if needed. And Ethan, with practiced quiet, stood guard, not as savior, not as hero, but as witness to a life reclaiming itself. In a world narrowed by storm and silence, the outpost felt suddenly less cold. And though no one said it aloud, all three souls felt it. Something had begun. Morning never truly arrived during the next day, or the next, because the storm had swallowed the sun. Ironwood Harbor remained trapped beneath a sky the color of dark pewter, spitting relentless flurries that erased horizons and swallowed sound. The wind had not roared. It had grown tired, shifting instead to a steady, mournful hum that threaded through door seams and window cracks. Snow had drifted halfway up the outpost walls, burying fences and signs and transforming the world outside into a blank, seamless expanse. The road to town, gone. The pier, merely a memory beneath ice. The harbor itself, a suggestion glimpsed through a fogged window. Inside the outpost, life narrowed to a small island of heat and breath. Ethan kept the generator running, with careful fuel rationing. Ridge kept silent watch at doors and windows. And Clara Benson, once a bride collapsing in snow, now stood on her own feet, wrapped in borrowed thermal leggings and a Coast Guard sweater that dwarfed her frame just slightly. She could walk, slowly, favoring one leg, but she could walk. Ethan didn't question her, now that the truth of her injury was plain. Clara didn't over-explain either. She simply moved cautiously, wincing occasionally, steadying herself with a hand on a table or Ridge's broad back. The woman who had woken as a frightened runaway now showed capacity and quiet bravery. She swept the floor to keep melted snow from freezing. She folded blankets. She helped inventory emergency rations. She moved with focused purpose, as though maintaining order inside helped hold chaos at bay outside. If Ethan was the stoic structure of the place, Clara became its quiet heartbeat. The heater rattled, casting amber light across metal walls, while Ridge lay in the warmest patch, tail thumping gently whenever Clara passed near. He had claimed her too, but in a different way than he claimed Ethan. With Ethan, Ridge was a partner. With Clara, Ridge was reassuring company. A dog's way of telling a wounded soul that the world wasn't only teeth. On the second evening, or perhaps night for time blurred, Ethan cooked a can of tomato stew on the small stovetop. Clara sat on a folded blanket, legs tucked beneath her, hands cupped around the steaming bowl he handed her. She took a spoonful, swallowed gratefully, and murmured, "Thank you." Ethan shrugged as if it was nothing, but feeding someone against the cold was never nothing. After a few bites, Clara's voice drifted into the small space, not forced, not dramatic, just honest. "Victor never yelled," she began. "He never hit me. That's what makes it harder to explain. He doesn't storm. He possesses." She stared into her stew, as though looking through it into memory. I realized it only in pieces. He'd remind me what clothes would elevate me, which social events were right for someone of our standing. He'd correct how I spoke to people in ways that sounded harmless, one suggestion at a time. It wasn't control through cruelty. It was control through refinement. Ethan listened without interruption. Clara rested the bowl on her knee. When he proposed, I didn't feel joy. I felt selected. She gave a sad laugh, brittle, honest. At first I thought that was my problem, that I was ungrateful, that I was broken, somehow unable to be happy. Snow rattled against the window, like fingers tapping. Ridge raised his head, sensing the tension in Clara's breathing. She exhaled slowly. I started hiding small things. Choices I'd make that weren't approved, books he wouldn't approve of, music he didn't like, and bank transfers into a private account my parents had set up before their accident. Her voice softened. They didn't leave me much, but they left me freedom, and I didn't realize how precious that was until someone tried to take it. Ethan's jaw tightened, not in judgment, but empathy. "Did anyone know you were planning to leave?" he asked. "Only a driver I paid discreetly," she replied. I told him to take me as far as the storm would allow. I didn't care where. Ironwood Harbor was just a name on a map, a place people wouldn't look for someone like me. Her hazel eyes lifted, studying Ethan. And you didn't ask questions, not at first. You didn't treat me like a puzzle to decode. You treated me like a person. Ethan didn't respond aloud, but his silence conveyed that he understood the difference. For 3 days, they existed like this. 2 humans and 1 dog, breathing together inside a snow-wrapped cocoon. They worked in sync. Ethan shoveled snow away from the generator exhaust, Clara steadying the shovel with thin but determined fingers. Ridge followed them outside, ears pivoting, scanning every shadow. Inside, Clara learned how to check fuel levels. Ridge showed her, through nudges and posture, when someone approached the door, even if it was just wind. Ethan taught her how to wrap a thermal blanket properly. At night, Clara slept on a cot. Ethan took the floor by the door. Ridge slept where he could guard them both. There were no romantic gestures, no dramatic confessions, just proximity, humanity, survival. On the 3rd morning, the storm finally broke. The first real sunlight in days spilled across the snow, turning Ironwood Harbor into something almost holy. Ethan opened the door and squinted into blinding brightness. Snowdrifts sparkled like powdered gemstones. Clara appeared beside him, hand braced on the doorway, eyes widening at the transformation. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Ethan replied, "and dangerous. Roads are buried. We'll need days before anyone can reach this outpost." Clara took a step forward, testing her leg. She still limped, but her movement was steady. Ridge trotted ahead, nose lifted, ears pricking in the changed air. Ethan and Clara began clearing snow from the entrance and windows, letting light into spaces that had forgotten it. As Clara reached for a crate on a top shelf inside the outpost, she lifted herself onto her toes and didn't wince. For a moment, her posture was effortless, strong. Ethan walked in just in time to catch the sight. He didn't misread it. He didn't accuse her. He simply observed what she had fought to reclaim, her strength. Clara looked at him, caught in that realization. And before insecurity could twist the moment, she spoke first. "My leg is better now, not perfect, but I don't need the chair." Ethan nodded once, accepting, not interrogating. Ridge wandered between them, tail gently swaying. Clara set the crate down and continued in a firmer voice. "I never pretended to be disabled. I just didn't want you to think I was helpless." The admission hung in the room, not as defense, but as truth. Ethan's reply was quiet but certain. "I don't think you're helpless." Clara exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. Their eyes met, not romantically, but respectfully. 2 equal souls in the same storm-forged space. Outside, the snow shone with new light. Inside, something weighed heavier for Clara, because in this returning silence, in this brief peace, she began to believe she had escaped. She began to believe Victor's reach had ended. She began to believe the storm had bought her freedom, but the world, especially the world belonging to powerful men, did not abandon what it believed it owned. And as the sun warmed the harbor's ice, something else, somewhere beyond the hills, had already begun moving toward Ironwood Harbor. The storm had died not with drama, but with resignation, as though winter itself had grown tired of its own fury. The winds faded into restless sighs. The snow settled into thick banks, sculpted around buildings like frozen sand dunes. Ironwood Harbor emerged from its white cocoon, slowly, cautiously, like a dreamer waking from a fevered sleep. Sunlight returned in pale, shy strands through the thinning clouds. Where ice had crusted over windows, delicate cracks formed, and light seeped in. The world had changed shape, color, and temperature, from white chaos to crystal-still quiet. Inside the outpost, the air no longer held urgent panic. The heater hummed steadily. Condensation began to trickle down walls. Boots dried beside the heater. Ridge sprawled near the door, half asleep, half sentinel, the way working dogs rest. Every muscle relaxed except the ones that matter. Ethan noted the morning weather conditions, updated the fuel status, and checked the emergency beacon. Still no signal to command, which meant still no contact to the outside world. The The main road remained buried. Plows would take days to reach this far down the coast. In this enforced isolation, routines formed, not as conscious decisions, but as necessary evolution. Clara rose each morning with the slow stretch of someone who had slept deeply for the first time in weeks, perhaps months. She brushed her hair back, now clean and dry, falling over her shoulders in dark, smooth waves. She wore Ethan's spare flannel shirt, too large at the sleeves, layered over thermal leggings. And over the last day or two, each movement of hers had subtly shifted from cautious to confident. On this morning, that shift reached its quiet culmination. Ethan had stepped outside briefly to clear snow from around the generator vent. When he returned, shaking lingering frost from his jacket, he caught sight of Clara. She stood on tiptoe at the kitchen shelf, barefoot, reaching upward to retrieve an old metal kettle stored above the stove. Her left leg, once tender from injury, supported her fully. Her right leg stretched behind her in a smooth, balanced curve, her posture aligned with grace, not pain, no limp, no hesitation, just capability. Ethan paused at the threshold. Time slowed, not for drama, but for recognition. This was not a revelation of deception. It was a revelation of recovery. Clara dropped back onto her heels as her fingers closed around the kettle. The simple act, turning and stepping down, felt like a declaration. When she faced Ethan, kettle in hand, she read something in his expression, a quiet question he hadn't yet spoken. Clara didn't look away. Instead, she lifted her chin and said, "It doesn't hurt anymore." Her voice was not defensive. It was steady, assured. Ethan's response was calm. "I can see that." Ridge stood and padded over to Clara, nudging her hand with his nose. Not suspicious, approving. Clara smiled faintly at the dog. He knew before either of us. Ethan allowed the smallest curl of a smile. He usually does. There was no anger in Ethan, no disappointment. Clara felt it and exhaled in relief. She set the kettle on the stove and rested her palms on the counter. Her eyes, hazel and unflinching, met Ethan's. "I didn't want you to think I was broken," she said. "You're not," Ethan replied simply. Clara let that settle before continuing. "I needed help when you found me, but I don't need to be carried anymore." The words held pride, not arrogance, the pride of a person reclaiming herself. Ethan nodded. "I never thought you were weak." She looked down for a moment, remembering snow, fear, collapse. "I felt weak," she admitted quietly. Ridge rested his head against her thigh, solid, grounding. Clara reached down and stroked the fur behind his ear. "I won't let him reduce me to that again." She didn't say Victor's name. She didn't need to. Silence followed, but it was no longer heavy. Ethan walked to the window, peering out over the harbor. Sunlight glinted off frozen rigging. A lone gull inspected the pier, pecking at nothing that remained. Clara joined him, kettle forgotten for the moment. Everything outside looked peaceful, but peace, Ethan knew, could be temporary. He had no illusions about how far wealth and power could stretch. He glanced sideways at her, voice low. "He'll look for you." Clara didn't pretend otherwise. "Of course he will. And he won't stop easily." "I know." Clara crossed her arms, rubbing her own shoulders in a thoughtful, reflexive motion. "Victor doesn't pursue out of love or loss," she said. "He pursues out of entitlement. He thinks I'm supposed to belong to him." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't belong to anyone." Clara gave a thin smile, appreciative but tired. "I've heard those words before," she said. "But coming from you, they feel real." Ethan didn't respond to that, because he didn't need to. Later, Clara helped organize the storage shelves. Ethan insisted she rest her leg now and then. Clara insisted she didn't need to. Ridge followed whichever one of them was moving the most. During lunch, Clara sat cross-legged on her cot, sipping broth from a tin cup. Ethan repaired a torn glove seam with a needle and nylon thread. Suddenly she spoke, aloud, but almost to herself. "I used to draw," she said, before him. Ethan looked up. "You stopped?" Clara nodded. "I stopped laughing, I stopped painting, I stopped making choices that weren't approved." Then she added softly, "I stopped being me." Ridge settled beside her and rested one paw on her foot. Clara smiled sadly. "I'm getting her back," she said, meaning herself. Ethan hummed in agreement. "Good." Evening crept in, a soft, deepening of shadows. They lit the lantern, casting a warm circular glow that felt like a hearth inside a frozen world. Clara sat on the floor near the heater, legs folded, massaging her calves. Finally, she said, quietly, firmly, "I'm not afraid of him anymore." And though her voice trembled at the edges, her spirit did not. Later that night, after Clara had gone to rest, Ethan stood outside on the small porch, looking out over Ironwood Harbor. The stars had returned, sharp, cold, innumerable. Ridge sat beside him, ears rotating like radar dishes. Ethan whispered, "Keep watch." The dog's posture shifted, alert, because Ethan was not afraid for Clara. He was afraid for the moment Victor arrived, and Ethan knew men like Victor. They weren't storms. They didn't roar. They advanced quietly, and they arrived, surely. Inside the outpost, Clara dreamed not of running, but of standing, barefoot, upright, unafraid, not owned, not hunted, simply herself. The truth was now visible, and Ethan had seen it. Clara Benson was no longer a fleeing bride. She was a rising force, and he feared not that Victor would overpower her, but that Victor would underestimate her. The harbor lay silent beneath the stars, caught between thaw and freeze, and the quiet seemed to whisper, "The storm is over." But the real battle has only just begun. 3 days after the storm had loosened its grip on Ironwood Harbor, the world finally seemed to breathe again. The coastal air lost its hostility. The ice on rooftops began to crack and weep, and snowbanks settled into soft, pillowed forms. The outpost no longer felt like a besieged island. It felt like a beginning. But peace, especially for people who had escaped something, is often only an intermission. The warning did not come as a sound. It came as Ridge. He had been lying by the door, head on his paws, pretending to nap. But suddenly his ears shot up, his head lifted, his nose pushed forward. A low rumble built in his chest, a growl not of immediate threat, but of detection. Ethan was at the table sorting emergency rations. Clara was folding bedding. They both froze when they heard the growl. Ethan turned to the dog. "What do you hear?" Ridge moved to the door and pressed against it. A split second later, they heard it too. Engine noise. Not a small vehicle, something heavy, powerful. Clara's breath caught. Ethan grabbed his jacket, stepped outside, and Ridge bolted through the crack in the door to his side. The sound grew, coming from the only access road leading down to the harbor. Then the vehicles appeared. A black SUV with tinted windows rolled to a slow, deliberate stop on the snow-packed road. Behind it, another vehicle, longer, matte gray, armored look, halted like a shadow. Clara, who had followed to the doorway, clutched the frame. She recognized the first SUV immediately. She whispered, "He found me." The passenger door of the SUV opened with smooth, effortless hydraulics. And out stepped Victor Hale. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with a build that came from private trainers and expensive gym memberships. His coat was charcoal cashmere, his gloves were leather, his dark hair was styled to look casually tousled, though every strand was deliberate. Victor had the face of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. His eyes scanned the harbor with the cold indifference of an appraiser evaluating property. Behind him emerged 2 men, bodyguards, stern, bulky, fitted in tactical weather gear, movements synchronized. One stayed by the SUV. The other walked behind Victor. Victor approached slowly, as though winter itself moved aside for him. Clara stepped out behind Ethan, chin raised despite the tremble in her breath. Victor's gaze fixed on her, and held. "There you are, Clara," he said warmly. The warmth of a velvet glove stretched over steel. She said nothing. Victor moved his eyes to Ethan. "And this must be the Good Samaritan. Officer Cole, I presume." Ethan kept his tone neutral. "This is a Coast Guard safety outpost. State your purpose." Victor gave a small smile, patient, smug. "I'm here for what belongs to me." Ethan's posture changed, shoulders squaring, feet planting. "Clara is not an..." Item, not property. Clara stepped forward. I'm not going with you, Victor. That stopped him. For a moment, surprise flickered in his eyes. Not shock that she refused, but disbelief that she would dare say it. Victor inhaled slowly, recalibrating his expression into something gentler. Clara, he said softly, I forgive you. You panicked. You fled. But it's done now. Let's go home. Clara looked at him without flinching. I panicked because I finally saw what you are. Victor's smile evaporated. He turned again to Ethan. You've inserted yourself into a private matter between engaged adults. She is my fiancée. No, Clara cut in. I was your fiancé, past tense. Victor's jaw flexed, a muscle like a coiled knot. The bodyguard to his right began walking forward. Ridge growled, louder this time. Victor lifted his hand dismissively. Easy, girl, he said to Clara. You don't understand how the world works. You don't simply walk away from people of my position, from commitments of this level, not without repercussions. Ethan stepped in front of Clara now, badge visible on his coat. She is under my protection until the authorities can make proper determination. Victor laughed, short, humorless. Authorities? Officer? I am the authorities. He gestured toward the expensive vehicles. I have legal teams, private investigators, political leverage, enough to crush any obstacle between myself and what I want. Ethan's voice was steady. Money doesn't change the law. Victor's eyes hardened. Money writes the law. That was when the bodyguard lunged. He moved fast, reaching for Clara's arm. But, faster than that, Ethan struck. He pivoted, hooked the man's wrist, twisted sharply, and locked his elbow inward. It was not flashy, just efficient. The bodyguard was face first in the snow in under 2 seconds. The second bodyguard rushed forward. Ridge charged. Not with wild aggression, but with perfect tactical control. He slammed into the man's hip, knocking his center of gravity sideways. The guard hit the ice with a thud. Wind knocked from his lungs. Ethan stepped between bodies, stance solid, ready. Victor had not expected competence, not expected resistance, and certainly not expected Clara to walk past Ethan, to stand before him, face to face. She spoke quietly, but each word struck like a hammer on cold iron. I don't belong to you. You don't own me, and I'm not afraid. Victor looked into her eyes. What he found there was not hysteria, not fragility, but clarity. Something in his gaze recoiled. For the first time, Clara did not fold beneath him. She did not negotiate. She did not attempt to soften the truth. For the first time, Victor Hale was not speaking to the porcelain doll he had molded. He was speaking to a woman who had stepped out of his grasp. Ethan kept silent. He let Clara's words do the work. Victor analyzed the situation, the dog, the officer, the law, then finally the girl. He straightened his coat. Then he simply said, "This isn't over." And with that, he gestured to his men. The bodyguard stood, shaken, embarrassed. Victor returned to the SUV, expression controlled but rigid. He didn't slam the door. Victor did not slam things. He closed it precisely, like a judge sealing a verdict. Engines roared to life. Snow spun beneath tires. The vehicles pulled away. Clara watched until they disappeared around the bend. Only when silence settled again did her breath finally tremble. Ethan stepped closer. "You did well," he said. She shook her head. "I just said the truth." "That takes courage." Ridge pressed against her leg. Warm, solid reassurance. Clara looked at the empty road one last time. Then she whispered, "He will come back." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I know." But for now, in that quiet, cold stillness, Clara Benson had finally won her first real battle. Winter eventually surrendered to spring, not in a single dramatic thaw, but slowly, steadily, as though the season were loosening its fingers one at a time. Snowbanks shrank, revealing salt-stained pavement beneath. Ice broke free of the dock pilings and drifted into the harbor like shattered glass. Pine boughs shook off their hoarfrost and began to stand upright again. Ironwood Harbor, which had held its breath for months, finally inhaled. In that newly liberated world, Clara Benson prepared to leave. The decision came quietly, without announcement or dramatic proclamation. It happened on an ordinary morning, sunlight glowing through thawed glass, Ridge asleep, nose down at Clara's foot. When Clara simply sat up, exhaled, and said to Ethan, "I need to go." Ethan didn't reply immediately. He finished tying the bootlace he was working on, then sat back on his heels. Ridge lifted his head, reading the mood. Clara stood with a calm dignity, not frantic, not fearful. The woman who had arrived half buried in snow was gone. This Clara stood with shoulders squared, gaze steady. She explained, "When Victor came, I realized something. I can't spend the rest of my life defining myself in opposition to him. If I stay here, I'm still reacting to him, hiding from him. I need to build a life that has nothing to do with him at all." Ethan nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" "I have a friend in Boston," Clara replied. "Melissa Pearson. We met at university. She always told me I stopped smiling after I got engaged. She used to tease me about it." Clara gave a tiny laugh. "Turns out she was right. She offered me a place to stay months ago. I never took it. I think it's time I do." Ethan respected that. Ridge pressed against Clara's leg, sensing change. She knelt to rub his ears, whispering, "Thank you for seeing me, even before I saw myself." The arrangements were simple: a ride from a local harbor worker, a ferry trip as soon as the channel reopened, a train connection north. She didn't flee this time. She departed. Before she left, Clara handed Ethan something wrapped in brown paper. He opened it later. A sketch, charcoal on thick paper, of the outpost under snow, with Ridge standing guard and Ethan emerging through drifting flakes. She had drawn it from memory. It matched reality almost eerily. When Clara boarded the ferry, Ethan stood with Ridge at the pier. She looked back once, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Ethan raised a hand. Ridge let out a soft, mournful whine. Then she disappeared across the steel-gray water. Months unfolded. Spring wriggled into full form. Seals sunned themselves on rocks. Fishermen returned to the harbor. Boats buzzed with activity. Seagulls screamed territorial hymns. The world was warmer and louder. Ethan resumed his duties in a routine that didn't feel heavy or lonely, just straightforward. He woke early, checked weather reports, ran inspections, patrolled shoreline paths, ate simple meals, talked to townsfolk when necessary, read in the evenings, and Ridge, always close, sometimes lifted his head toward the road, as if expecting someone. Occasionally, Ethan also glanced there, though he didn't admit to himself why. Life expanded, then balanced. In Boston, Clara Benson began a different kind of season. Melissa Pearson, her friend, was a lively, petite woman with curly blonde hair, quick humor, and fierce loyalty. She welcomed Clara with a yell of delight and an unrestrained hug. Melissa's apartment was full of color: throw pillows, prints, warm lamps, books scattered everywhere. A space that felt alive. Clara slept on a futon near a window that overlooked a park. Within a week, she began therapy with Dr. Harland, a middle-aged therapist with gentle phrasing and firm insight. He didn't ask, "How did Victor control you?" He asked, "When did you first start silencing your inner voice?" That mattered. Clara learned to rewire her beliefs, one thread at a time. She rediscovered her hobbies, painting watercolor scenes in muted tones. She took a part-time job at an art supply store, organizing brushes, canvases, pigments. She learned to exist without checking over her shoulder. She relearned laughter. She relearned stillness. She relearned herself. The first time she caught a glimpse of her reflection and thought, "I like the woman I see." She cried from the shock of it. Months passed. Victor did not attempt another confrontation. Whether because of legal constraints, embarrassment, or exhaustion, he faded from active pursuit. Clara's life neutralized, and in that equilibrium, she found direction. One warm late May morning, she packed a small bag. Melissa watched her with a knowing look. "You're going back?" Melissa asked. Clara smiled without guilt or uncertainty. "Yes." "To him?" Melissa teased, without implication of romance. "No," Clara replied. "To me To the moment I stopped being afraid. Melissa nodded. And to the dog. Clara laughed. Yes, and to the dog. Ironwood Harbor was different when Clara returned. Not because the town had changed, but because she had. Green shoots peppered the hills. The sea was restless again, not frozen. The scent of thawed earth mingled with salt air. She walked the harbor road on her own feet, with a confidence that was visible in her gait. Calm, long-strided, purposeful. Before she reached the outpost, Ridge saw her. He burst from the building like a released arrow, sprinting full speed across the snow-free ground. His tail wagged so hard his hips rocked with each stride. He barked once, loud, joyous, before leaping up and nearly knocking Clara backward. She cupped his face in her hands. I missed you too. Ethan followed at a slower pace. He stepped into the daylight and onto the gravel, stopping a few feet from her. He looked different too, relaxed, at ease, the winter weight gone from his posture. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clara did. Her voice was clear, unshaken. This time, I'm not here because I need to be protected. I'm here because I choose to be here. Ethan simply nodded. Clara continued. I don't want to be a rescued person anymore. I want to be a person who stands with others, not behind them. Ridge sat proudly between them, enjoying the reunion. Ethan finally responded, not grandly, but honestly. I'm glad you're here. Clara smiled, the kind of smile that comes from a healed core. I'm glad too. They didn't embrace. They didn't exchange vows or promises. There was no sweeping musical swell. There was just the clean, steady presence of two individuals, each whole, choosing to walk forward side by side. And in that quiet harbor, beneath a soft spring sun, winter lost its final grip. Sometimes the miracles God sends do not appear in blazing signs or mighty wonders. Sometimes they arrive gently through the loyalty of a dog who refuses to abandon you, through the steady courage of a man who stands by you, and through the quiet healing God places in a heart that once felt broken. This story reminds us that God walks beside us not only in great storms, but in the ordinary days when we are rebuilding our lives, rediscovering our worth, and taking one brave step at a time. May this story encourage you to trust that God is always working, even when His miracles seem quiet. If this touched your heart, please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to support us. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength wherever you are watching from. And if you believe in the gentle miracles He sends, type Amen in the comments.